The platform reeked of blood and sport and something else. Something acrid that Scott's engineer brain identified as the chemical markers the Azuri left everywhere they went. Territorial scent, probably, though his human nose could barely detect it. The structure itself was impressive in its crude efficiency. Wooden poles as thick as his thigh lashed together with fibrous vines that looked like braided steel cable. The whole thing creaked and swayed under the weight of 24 Azuri warriors, their blue skin gleaming like polished stone in the harsh midday sun, filtering through the breaks in the jungle canopy. They laughed with the casual cruelty of apex predators watching prey panic in a trap. Scott had heard that sound before, in the weeks since his capture. It was the same laugh they made when they threw scraps to the humans and watched them scramble. The same laugh when they pitted humans against each other in the fighting circles. A sound utterly without empathy, because to the Azuri, humans weren't people. They were things, resources, entertainment. She stood at the edge, one foot propped on the railing, surveying the miserable collection of humans huddled in the dirt below, like a general reviewing defeated troops. The huntress was 27 standard years, all coiled muscle and sharp angles, her blue skin marked with ritual scars that told stories to those who could read them. Each line represented a successful kill, a worthy hunt, a moment of perfect violence. There were many lines. Her clan called her Vex, though that was the human approximation of a sound that involved harmonics human vocal cords couldn't produce. The actual name meant something like "She Who Breaks the Fast Ones," a title earned through 10 years of flawless hunts. Her body was a weapon honed to perfection. Bone ridges curved along her forearms and shoulders, natural armor that had turned aside more than one desperate blow from cornered prey. Her fingers ended in retractable claws, currently sheathed but capable of extending 2 centimeters of keratin, sharp enough to open flesh. Her legs were digitigrade, giving her explosive jumping power and the ability to run at speeds that would leave most Earth predators behind. She was, by every measure her culture valued, perfect. She had never lost a hunt, not once, not ever. "Look at this one," she called out, her voice carrying that strange melodic quality all Azuri possessed, like wind through hollow bones. She pointed directly at Scott. "The old male, gray fur on his head. See how his belly hangs?" Laughter rippled through the assembled hunters. One of them, a younger male with fresh bone growth jutting from his elbows, leaned forward. "How much for him?" "3 marks he falls first," Vex said, grinning. "This bag of bones will drop before the sun moves a hand's width." Scott met her gaze without flinching. He was 45 years old by Earth standard, though the local calendar made it closer to 52. His hair was more gray than brown now, temples completely silver, the kind of gray that came early to men who'd spent decades in high-radiation environments. His face was weathered, carved with lines from 2 decades of squinting at gauges and readouts, from breathing recycled air on colony ships, from the constant low-level stress of maintaining life support systems that kept thousands of people alive. His body told a different story than Vex's. Where she was all lean efficiency, he carried weight around his middle, the inevitable consequence of a metabolism slowed by age and sedentary work. His hands were scarred from machinery, thick-fingered and competent, the hands of a man who'd rebuilt atmospheric processors with nothing but spare parts and determination. His shoulders were broad but rounded, muscles built for lifting equipment rather than fighting. He looked exactly like what he was, a maintenance engineer who'd spent 23 years working terraforming equipment on 7 different colony worlds. The colony administration had listed his occupation as Chief Environmental Systems Technician, which was a fancy way of saying he kept the air breathable and the water clean. Before the Azuri had raided the southern pumping station, he'd been 40 hours into a 72-hour shift trying to prevent a cascade failure in the water reclamation system. He'd been dirty, exhausted, running on caffeine and sheer stubbornness when they'd taken him. That was 6 weeks ago. He didn't look away, didn't plead. His pale gray eyes simply assessed her equipment with the same methodical attention he'd give a faulty hydraulic system. The helmet made from a local predator's skull, probably a ridgecat based on the orbital structure. The light armor of treated hide, the machete at her hip, the throwing spears on her back. He cataloged it all. Something in that steady gaze made Vex uncomfortable. She turned away, reaching for the skull helmet. "Let's give these meat sacks something to run from," she said, sliding it over her head. The hollow eye sockets made her look like death itself. Below, in what the Azuri called the processing yard, though the humans had darker names for it, 23 humans stood or sat in various states of despair. They'd been taken from the northern colony settlements over the past month, snatched during supply runs or from isolated farms where help couldn't arrive in time. The Azuri hunting parties had been ranging farther each season, growing bolder, taking more. Marcus was the youngest at 19 standard years, a hydroponics tech with barely a year on world under his belt. Still had that colony-fresh optimism, or had until about 3 days ago. Now he couldn't stop shaking, his pale hands trembling so hard he had to clasp them together. "We're going to die," he kept saying, the words running together. Oh God, we're all going to die out there." "Shut up," hissed Regina. She was 32, a terraformer from Scott's crew, someone who'd worked the big machines that reshaped worlds. Tough as recycled steel, she'd said once. Nothing organic left in her but the mean parts. But even her voice cracked now, carrying an edge of hysteria she was fighting to control. "Just shut up and think. We need to think." "Think about what?" Marcus's voice climbed toward a shriek. "They're going to hunt us like animals, like those six-legged deer things we saw. They're going to run us down and kill us for sport." Others huddled in small groups, some praying to gods that seemed very distant on this alien world, others just sitting in numb silence. There was Upton, a surveyor who'd lost most of his fingers to frostbite on a polar expedition 3 years back. Vincent, a crop engineer who'd been taken from his own fields. Susanna, a medic who'd watched 3 people die from Azuri torture and couldn't stop washing her hands even though there was no water. Regina had tried to organize them, tried to create some kind of plan, but fear had scattered any semblance of unity. Scott sat apart from the group, cross-legged on the hard-packed earth that had been trampled by countless feet over the weeks or months the Azuri had been using this location. He'd already stripped sections from his torn jumpsuit, the tough synthetic fabric colony administration issued to everyone. It was designed to resist tears and punctures, rated for temperatures from -40 to +60 Celsius. Good fabric, useful. His fingers moved with practiced precision, muscle memory from years of emergency repairs, where the difference between success and failure was a properly tied knot or a secure connection. He was weaving strips together, creating longer, stronger pieces through a braiding technique he'd learned from a documentary about ancient sailing ships. The movements were automatic, leaving his mind free to assess, plan, calculate. First priority, footwear. His colony boots were sturdy enough, composite soles designed for uneven terrain, but the jungle would tear them apart in days. He needed protection. He wrapped the braided fabric around his boots, reinforcing the soles, building up extra padding at the heel and ball of the foot where the pressure would be greatest. Then he wound the strips up his calves, creating makeshift gaiters that would protect against the thorns he'd observed in the jungle undergrowth. Each wrap was tested, each knot checked for slippage. A loose binding could cause blisters. Blisters could become infected. Infection could kill you as surely as any predator. Second priority, water. The jumpsuit had an inner layer of waterproof membrane, originally designed to protect against chemical spills. He carefully separated this layer, creating a makeshift bag that could hold perhaps half a liter. Not much, but it could mean the difference between thinking clearly and making fatal mistakes when dehydration set in. Third priority, weapons. He had nothing. The Azuri had stripped everyone of tools, of anything that could be used as a weapon. But Scott's eyes had been cataloging since they'd brought him to the processing yard. There, half buried in the dirt, a piece of scrap metal, probably from some broken tool. It was maybe 20 centimeters long, rusted and worthless to the Azuri. To Scott, it was a knife waiting to happen. He palmed it when no one was looking, tucking it into his makeshift pack. "Scott!" Regina crawled over to him. "Scott, what are you doing?" "Preparing," he said simply. His hands didn't stop moving. He tested each knot, checking for slippage. "For what?" "They're going to kill us." He glanced up at her, and she saw something in his face that made her pause. Not hope, exactly. More like grim determination, the look of a man settling in for a long shift on a failing system with no backup. Some of us, maybe, he said, but not all of us, and not quickly. He went back to his work. You see those blue thorns on the trees? The ones pulsing with bioluminescence? Regina looked where he indicated. The jungle beyond the processing yard was like nothing on Earth, a riot of alien vegetation that followed convergent evolution, but twisted it in disturbing ways. Black-barked trees twisted toward the sky, their trunks studded with long, wickedly sharp thorns that glowed with a faint blue light. The pulsing was rhythmic, about 40 beats per minute, like a slow heartbeat. The scientific part of Regina's brain wondered if it was actual vascular flow, if the tree was pumping luminescent compounds through the thorns as a warning to herbivores. The engineering part of her brain just registered. Danger. I see them, she said. Neurotoxin. Saw a local six-legged grazer brush against one yesterday when they marched us past. Scott's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing equipment failure rather than deadly poison. It happened fast. The animal was grazing, leaned in to get at some leaves, shoulder touched a thorn. Paralysis hit in under 5 seconds. Complete loss of motor function. The thing was still breathing, still had its eyes open, but it couldn't move, couldn't even blink. Did it recover? Don't know. The Azuri dragged it off, probably for food, but I timed it. Exposure to full paralysis, 4.3 seconds. That's fast enough that your autonomic nervous system might keep working, keep your heart beating and lungs breathing, but everything voluntary just shuts down. Regina stared at the trees with new understanding. We go in there. We have to be careful. Slow and careful, Scott confirmed. He finished with his boots and started on a second set of wrappings. These thinner, designed for hand protection. The thorns aren't everywhere. There are safe paths. I've been watching. The local animals know them. The thorns grow in response to damage, defensive adaptation, but they also need sunlight to produce the toxin. The areas of deepest shadow under the thickest canopy, the thorns are there, but they're smaller, less potent. How do you know all this? I don't, not for sure, but I've spent 20 years on colony worlds, Regina. You learn to read ecosystems, learn to see the patterns. He looked up at her, and she saw that his eyes weren't empty. There was calculation there, planning. Life tends toward efficient solutions. Same problems get solved the same ways, even on different worlds. Predator-prey dynamics, resource competition, defense mechanisms, different biochemistry, but similar strategies. Slow. Marcus had heard them. His face was pale, slick with sweat. They're hunters. We need to run. Scott looked at the boy, really looked at him, taking in the wild eyes, the trembling hands. You run if you want, kid, but I've seen you trip over your own feet in the equipment bay. You won't last 10 minutes in there at a sprint. So what? We just let them catch us? No. Scott stood, testing his wrapped feet. The extra padding felt good, distributing his weight. We make them work for it. A deep, resonant note rolled across the processing yard. The Azuri horn, carved from the tusk of some massive creature, announced the beginning of the hunt. The sound seemed to vibrate in Scott's chest, in his bones. Immediately, humans scattered. Most ran for the tree line. Instinct overriding thought. The Azuri had designed it this way, Scott realized with grim clarity. The processing yard opened directly onto the densest, most dangerous part of the jungle. Running blindly was suicide, but fear made people run anyway. Marcus was among the first, sprinting with the desperate speed of pure terror. His arms pumped, his legs churned, breath coming in great sobbing gasps that carried across the yard. 20 meters, 25, 30. He was weaving between the black-barked trees, showing decent athletic instinct, but his eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on some imaginary safety ahead. Then his shoulder clipped one of the blue thorns. The effect was instant and terrible to watch. His legs simply stopped working mid-stride. No gradual weakening, no stumble. One moment he was running full speed, the next his lower body was completely paralyzed. His momentum carried him forward into a tumbling fall, limbs that should have caught him hanging limp and useless. He hit the ground face first, and Scott heard the wet crack of breaking bone even from 20 meters away. Blood sprayed from Marcus's nose and mouth, painting the dark soil. Marcus's eyes were open. That was somehow the worst part. Scott could see them, could see the panic and awareness still there. The neurotoxin had paralyzed his voluntary muscles, but left his consciousness intact. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink to clear the dirt and blood from his eyes. He just lay there, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths that his autonomic nervous system controlled, while his eyes showed full awareness of his helplessness. From the platform, the Azzurri laughed. The sound was worse than their hunting cries. It was casual amusement, the kind of laughter you'd give a mildly entertaining accident, completely devoid of empathy or concern. Two of them dropped from the platform, landing with feline grace that barely disturbed the undergrowth. They grabbed Marcus by his arms, his body hanging between them like a broken doll, and dragged him back toward the center of the yard. His limp body left furrows in the dirt, his feet dragging, head lolling. They dumped him in the middle of the processing yard like a sack of grain. One of them, the younger male with the elbow spurs, pressed a foot on Marcus's chest, casually, like a hunter posing with a trophy. He said something in their own language, a series of melodic tones that clearly was a joke based on how the others responded. The assembled Azzurri laughed again, harder this time. Scott watched it all with forced detachment, his engineer's mind cataloging data. Exposure to paralysis, under 5 seconds. Duration, unknown but likely measured in hours. Effect on victim, conscious paralysis, trauma from impact, probable serious injury. Status, non-recoverable in current situation. Marcus was functionally dead. Even if the paralysis wore off in the hour or two the Azzurri seemed to expect, he'd be a lesson left in plain sight, a warning, an object of terror. Jesus Christ, Susanna whispered. The medic had gone pale, her hands shaking worse than before. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus's broken form. We have to help him. We have to. No, Scott said flatly. But he's still alive. His eyes are... He's an example. Scott's voice was hard, engineer cold. He'd seen accidents before, seen people caught in machinery that couldn't be stopped, systems that would kill you if you tried to intervene. You learned to compartmentalize, to save who you could and accept the losses. You go near him, they'll do the same to you. Or worse. So we just leave him? Susanna's voice cracked. We learn from him. Scott turned to face the small group that had gathered around him, the ones who hadn't run yet. Regina, Susanna, Upton with his damaged hands, Vincent looking shell-shocked, a few others whose names he didn't know. The thorns are exactly as dangerous as I thought. Running blind gets you killed. We need to move smart, not fast. Smart how? Upton asked. His voice was surprisingly steady for a man looking at his probable death. Slow, careful. Watch where you step, where you brush against. Follow game trails where you can. They'll be the safest paths. Avoid the densest growth. And for God's sake, don't panic and run. They're hunters, someone said. Scott thought it might have been one of the farmers, a woman named Shane. Running is what they expect. What if we hide instead? Won't work. Scott shook his head. They have better senses than us, better tracking. This is their world, but they're ambush predators, built for speed and power, not endurance. He paused, making sure they were listening. You want to survive? Make them chase you. Make them work for it. Tire them out. Don't try to win. Try to make it too expensive for them to bother. That's insane, Vincent said. You saw them. They're faster, stronger. For a sprint, yes, but I've worked on 7 colony worlds, watched the ecology of everyone. Predators that rely on explosive power, they overheat fast. They need rest. They can't sustain effort the way we can. Scott looked at each of them. I can't promise you'll survive. I can't even promise I'll survive. But I can promise that if you give up and let them have an easy hunt, you're dead. Make them work for it, and some of us might make it through. Regina was nodding slowly. The endurance thing, I've heard about that. Old Earth evolution. Persistence hunting, Scott confirmed. Humans used to chase an antelope across the savannah until the animal died from heat exhaustion. We're not built for speed. We're built to just keep going. The Azuri horn sounded again, a second note, higher pitched, the 1-minute warning before the hunters would enter the jungle themselves. Go, Scott said. Different directions. Don't cluster. And remember, slow and steady. Make them chase you. They scattered, but this time with more purpose. Regina went north, following a stream she'd spotted. Upton headed west, moving carefully despite his injured hands. The others chose their own paths. Scott waited until they were gone. Then he knelt beside his pack one more time, checking everything. Water bladder, secure. Scrap metal knife, wrapped and packed. Foot bindings, tight but not cutting off circulation. He stood, took one last look at Marcus's paralyzed form and the Azuri warriors watching from the platform with those cold, amused eyes. Then he walked to the eastern edge of the processing yard. He didn't hurry, didn't sprint. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to put distance between himself and the hunters. But he forced those instincts down with the iron discipline of a man who'd spent decades fighting his own panic in emergency situations. He licked his finger and held it up, feeling for air movement. The wind came from the west, carrying the green rot smell of the jungle mixed with something sweet and cloying, probably decomposing vegetation. Good. Wind from the west meant he should head east, keeping the wind at his back so his scent would carry away from his trail. He found what he was looking for after 2 minutes of careful searching, a game trail, barely visible through the undergrowth. It wasn't much, just a slight depression in the leaf litter where some animal or group of animals passed regularly enough to create a path. But it meant the trail was stable, tested, less likely to have the most dangerous thorns. Scott stepped onto it. His breathing fell into a rhythm, in through the nose, counting 4 beats, out through the mouth, counting 4 beats. He rolled each foot from heel to toe, testing the ground before committing his weight, the way you'd test a ladder rung before climbing. His whole body settled into a kind of mechanical efficiency. The pace was deliberate, economical. About 4 kilometers per hour, he estimated, slower than a normal walk, but sustainable indefinitely. It was called the wolf walk, though Scott had learned it from an old documentary about human evolution, back when he'd been 14 and obsessed with ancient history. The gait our ancestors used when they hunted antelope across the African savanna. Not fast, but sustainable. A pace that could eat up kilometers without burning through energy reserves. The jungle swallowed him within minutes. The canopy was so dense it turned midday into twilight. The black-bark trees grew thick here, their trunks twisted and gnarled, studded with those blue thorns that pulsed with slow, rhythmic light. The undergrowth was a tangle of alien ferns, with fronds like razor blades, vines that oozed sticky sap, mushroom-like growths that released clouds of spores when disturbed. Scott moved through it all like a ghost. When the trail narrowed, he turned sideways, minimizing his profile. When low-hanging thorny branches blocked the path, he went under them on hands and knees rather than breaking through. He left minimal sign, a few compressed leaves, the occasional scuff mark in the moss, but nothing obvious. Nothing that screamed, "Human, pass this way." The sounds of the processing yard faded behind him. In their place came the alien symphony of the jungle. Insect analogs buzzed and chirped with sounds like broken electronics. Something in the canopy made a rhythmic booming noise, probably some kind of territorial display. In the distance, he heard something scream, high-pitched, agonized, cut short. Another hunt, somewhere out there in the green darkness. Scott kept walking, left foot, right foot, breathe. His mind started to settle into the rhythm, entering that state of moving meditation that long-distance walkers knew. His body handled the physical process while his conscious mind drifted, assessing, planning, calculating odds. The Azuri would give him maybe 10 more minutes before they followed. They seemed to enjoy the fear, the desperate flight. Let the prey exhaust themselves first. Then when the humans were tired and scared, the hunters would come. Vex would come for him specifically. He'd seen it in her eyes when she made her bet. She'd chosen him as her quarry, the old, slow one who should be easy sport. She probably expected to find him collapsed under a bush within an hour, weeping and broken. Let her think that. Let her come looking for easy prey, because Scott had no intention of being easy. Vex stepped off the platform 12 minutes after the horn sounded. She'd given them a head start. It made the hunt more interesting, more sporting. More importantly, it let the prey exhaust themselves in panic, made them sloppy and desperate. Easy. Her clan brothers and sisters fanned out in different directions, each choosing their own quarry from the scattered humans. There were enough to go around. Vix, her younger brother, headed north after the female terraformer. Kral, the elder with the crown of bone ridges, went west tracking the damaged male with missing fingers. The others chose their own paths. Vex had already announced her choice to the assembled watchers. The old one, the gray-furred male who thought he could stare at her like she was something to be measured and calculated rather than feared. She was going to enjoy breaking him. She moved through the jungle like water flowing downhill, all smooth economy of motion. Her species had evolved in forests like these, though on a world 3 systems away, before the migration ships had brought them here. The Azuri were ambush predators by nature, capable of incredible bursts of speed, able to leap 3 times their body length and land without sound. Their digitigrade legs were springs of compressed power. Their retractable claws could find purchase on bark, rock, even the smooth metal of human buildings. She was wearing her hunting gear, light armor of treated razorback hide that could turn aside most primitive weapons, the skull helmet of a ridge cat she'd killed in single combat 3 years ago, her bone-handled machete that had tasted the blood of 17 prey species. On her back, 3 throwing spears with obsidian tips, each balanced for her specific throwing style. She felt magnificent, alive. This was what her species was made for. Not the tedious work of building settlements or farming the land. That was for lesser clans. The hunt, the chase, the moment when prey realized it was beaten and fear turned to acceptance. That was what made life worth living. She found her first human within 10 minutes, a younger female, hiding in a tangle of roots like a frightened animal. The woman had lasted longer than most, shown some basic survival instinct in choosing a hiding spot that would confound scent tracking. But Vex didn't need scent. She read the broken stems, the disturbed moss, the subtle signs that humans left everywhere they went like a trail of breadcrumbs. One clean strike with the club she carried, calculated to stun rather than kill, and the woman went down in a heap. Vex bound her hands with quick, efficient movements and moved on. She'd collect the body later. Right now she wanted to find the old one, the one who dared to look at her like she was something to be studied. His trail was obvious to her trained eyes. Broken stems, disturbed moss, the faint scuff marks in the decomposing leaf matter. But the trail confused her. It didn't show the desperate, panicked flight she expected. The spacing of the marks was too regular, too controlled. She followed it deeper into the jungle, where the blue thorns grew thickest. Here the canopy was so dense that the light took on a submarine quality, green and filtered. The thorns pulsed brighter in the dimness, their toxin glands swollen with poison. Vex had to slow down. Even with her natural armor, the thorns could penetrate if she wasn't careful. She used her machete to cut through the densest parts, each swing burning energy. That's when she found the first sign that made her pause. A section of thorny vine had been carefully bent back and secured with a stripped piece of fabric. Not broken, not cut. Bent back to create a path barely wide enough for a human body to slip through. The old one hadn't fought his way through. He'd gone around, under, through the gaps, where she had to hack and slash, burning energy with every strike. He'd moved like smoke, finding the paths of least resistance. It took her 20 minutes to traverse a section that should have taken 5. When she emerged on the other side, sweating and irritable, she looked at the trail ahead and felt the first small seed of doubt. The sun dropped behind the canopy, and the temperature plummeted. On this world, the jungle had a tighter water cycle than Earth. The days were saunas, but the nights turned bitter fast, the heat radiating away into a sky choked with dust from the volcanic ranges to the south. Vex felt it immediately. Her species came from a hot, dry world. The Azuri had a metabolism built for explosive action in warm conditions, but they paid for it. They had no sweat glands distributed across their skin. They cooled themselves by panting, like earth dogs, and when the temperature dropped, their bodies began to shut down, conserving energy for core functions. She found a sheltered spot under an overhang, pulled out her chemical heat pack, and cracked it. The exothermic reaction began immediately, providing blessed warmth. She curled around it, her body instinctively seeking to conserve energy. The human would be doing the same, she thought. Shivering in the dark, terrified, unable to move. She was wrong. Scott had been walking for 7 hours. His internal clock, honed by years of shift work on colony installations, told him it was around 2100 hours. His legs ached. His feet, despite the wrapping, were developing blisters. His lower back, which had given him trouble since a crane accident 5 years ago, was a constant band of fire. He ignored it all. From his pack, he pulled out a root he'd harvested 3 hours earlier. It looked like a twisted piece of wood, gray and unpromising, but when he'd seen a local herbivore eating it, he'd made note. He tested it carefully, rubbing a small piece on his skin first, waiting for a reaction. When none came, he'd tried a tiny amount on his tongue. Bitter as hell, but there was a tingle to it, a sense of alertness. Now he chewed it methodically, feeling the stimulant properties hit his system. His heart rate picked up slightly. The fog of exhaustion pulled back a few inches. Left foot, right foot. Breathe in, he muttered to himself. Left foot, right foot. Breathe out. The mantra helped, turned walking into a mechanical process, something he could maintain while his conscious mind dealt with other problems, like navigation, like avoiding the territorial markers he'd started seeing, deep claw gouges in the black bark, too high for any human to reach. Something big lived in this part of the jungle, something that didn't sleep at night. He heard it before he saw it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Scott froze, his hand moving slowly to the sharpened stick he'd been working on as he walked. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. The creature emerged from the darkness like a living shadow. It was massive, easily 3 meters at the shoulder, with 6 legs and a coat of shaggy blue fur that seemed to absorb light. Its head was all teeth and angles, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern. A whistle bear, the colonists called them, because of the eerie whistling sound they made when agitated. This one wasn't whistling. It was growling, a subsonic rumble that Scott felt in his sternum. He didn't run. Running triggered predator drive. Instead, he stood still, making himself as large as possible, and he roared back. The sound that came from his throat was pure human aggression, the war cry of a species that had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. It startled the whistle bear. The creature took a step back, its 4 eyes blinking in sequence. Scott roared again, this time banging his stick against a tree trunk, creating noise and chaos. The whistle bear decided this strange, loud creature wasn't worth the trouble. It turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving Scott alone with his hammering heart and shaking hands. He waited 10 minutes, listening. Then he started walking again. Left foot, right foot, breathe. Vex woke with the dawn, her body stiff from the cold. She cracked another heat pack, drank from her water bladder, and chewed a strip of dried meat. The protein would give her energy for the morning's hunt. She expected to find the human within an hour. She was Azuri after all, superior in every measurable way. Faster, stronger, better adapted to this environment. The old one would have managed maybe 5, perhaps 7 kilometers overnight before exhaustion forced him to stop. She ran his trail at a loping pace that ate up ground. 1 hour passed, then 2. The trail just kept going, regular, methodical, endlessly forward. At the 3-hour mark, she found his rest stop, a slight depression in the moss where he'd sat, maybe for 2 minutes, just long enough to adjust his foot wrappings. The fibers he'd discarded told the story. He'd noticed a hot spot forming on his left heel and had redistributed the padding. Vex stared at the spot. She pulled out a rough map she carried, marked with the major terrain features the Azuri had scouted. If her calculation was correct, the human had covered nearly 40 kilometers through hostile jungle, in the dark, without stopping. It was impossible. Her species couldn't do it. No one could. But the evidence was right there, in the endless, patient trail of footprints leading ever onward. For the first time, Vex felt something she'd never experienced in a hunt before. Uncertainty. She pushed it down and ran faster. The river appeared suddenly, as they often did in jungle terrain. One moment Scott was walking through dense undergrowth. The next he stood on a rocky bank, looking at a roiling torrent of white water. It was at least 30 meters across, moving fast, littered with fallen trees and debris. The water was a milky blue color, probably from mineral runoff from the volcanic highlands. Scott studied it for 10 minutes. The current would be brutal. The water was cold. He could feel it from here. There were rapids downstream. He could hear them, which meant rocks and a strong chance of broken bones. He looked behind him, didn't see his pursuer, but he knew she was back there somewhere. He'd been leaving sign deliberately, making sure she stayed on his trail. He made his decision. First, he stripped down to his underclothes, bundling everything else into his makeshift pack. He tied it tight, sealed with the waterproof inner layer of his jumpsuit. Then he found a piece of driftwood, solid but not too heavy, and lashed his pack to it. He took 3 deep breaths, hyperventilating to load his blood with oxygen. Then he threw the driftwood toward the far bank and dove in after it. The cold was a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The current grabbed him immediately, pulling him downstream. Scott didn't fight it. He angled across the current, using its energy, swimming with powerful strokes that his mandatory colony fitness regimen had kept sharp. The water tried to drown him. It filled his mouth, his nose, pounded him with its weight. A submerged rock caught his shin, and he felt something tear. Pain shot up his leg, but he kept swimming. The far bank came up fast. He grabbed for a root, missed, grabbed again. His fingers closed on rough wood and held. He pulled himself up, gasping, his body shaking so hard his teeth rattled. The driftwood with his pack had snagged on a fallen tree 10 meters downstream. He had to wade back into the current to retrieve it, his torn shins screaming protest, but he got it. On the far bank, he lay in the sun for exactly 5 minutes, letting his body warm. Then he dressed in his wet clothes, unwrapped his feet to let them dry, and started walking again. Vex reached the river an hour later, running at full speed. She skidded to a halt at the bank, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The old human had crossed. The trail was clear on the far side, and there was no ford, no bridge, no way across except through the water. She stared at the churning current. Azuri bone density was higher than human, an evolutionary adaptation that provided protection against the bone-breaking falls that came from their aggressive arboreal lifestyle. It made them strong, difficult to injure. It also made them sink like stones in water. Vex couldn't swim. No Azuri could. They were smart enough to build boats, rafts, but she had none of those things. She would have to go upstream, find a crossing, probably 5 or 6 kilometers, then come back down the other side. She screamed her frustration at the river, at the human who just put hours between them with one clever move. Then she started running upstream. The detour cost her 3 hours and most of her water. By the time she crossed on a natural dam of fallen trees, testing each step on the treacherous wet wood, and made it back down the other side of the river, the sun was past its zenith and her mood was black as the jungle bark. Her injured knee throbbed with every step. Her water bladder was nearly empty, her stomach cramped with hunger. But she had his trail again, and this time she pushed herself harder, faster, burning through her energy reserves with reckless determination. This was personal now. The old human had made it personal when he'd crossed that river, when he'd forced her to waste hours. She found him in the bamboo grove in the late afternoon. The plants here weren't true bamboo, but they served the same ecological function, fast-growing, densely packed, creating a nearly impassable barrier of woody stems as thick as Scott's arm. The local herbivores had created a tunnel-like trail through them, probably made by some species of burrower. Scott had found it, was using it, moving through the narrow passage with his pack scraping the walls. Vex didn't bother with subtlety. She came at him like a missile, exploding from the bamboo behind him with her machete raised high. The blade was obsidian, chipped and honed to a molecular edge, capable of splitting bone. She'd killed with it 17 times. This would be 18. Scott had heard her coming. The Azuri were fast, frighteningly fast, but they weren't quiet when angry. Their bone ridges rattled. Their breathing was harsh and loud. He'd been listening for her for the past hour, had known she was close. When she struck, he was already moving. He dropped. Not a dive, not a duck, but a complete collapse backward. An ungainly move that no warrior would teach because it gave up all advantage, left you vulnerable on your back. But it worked. Her blade whistled over him, so close he felt the air move, felt the wind of its passage. It struck the bamboo behind where his head had been, cutting through it with a sharp crack. She was overextended, committed to the strike, off balance for a crucial half-second. Scott's leg shot out. Not a kick, not a sweep, but a precise strike to the side of her planted knee. He aimed for the lateral collateral ligament, the vulnerability he'd spotted when he'd cataloged her movement patterns during his captivity. Hit it with his heel, all his remaining strength focused into that one point. He felt something give, a wet popping sensation that transmitted up through his leg. Vex's knee buckled and she went down hard, crashing into the bamboo wall. The stems cracked and splintered under her weight. She hit the ground in a tangle of broken plants, her machete flying from her grip. Scott scrambled backward, his movements clumsy and desperate. He grabbed his sharpened stick, the crude spear he'd been working on for 2 days, and got his feet under him. For a moment, they stared at each other. Vex's face was a mask of pain and rage, her blue skin flushed darker with exertion. Her hands clawed at the ground, trying to find purchase to stand. Her damaged knee wouldn't support her weight. Scott could have ended it then, could have driven his spear through her throat, finished the hunt, claimed the victory. She was helpless, beaten. Instead, he straightened up, adjusted his grip on the spear, and started walking, not running, not even hurrying, just maintaining that same steady, inexorable pace that had carried him 40 kilometers through the jungle. Left foot, right foot, breathe. It was deliberate. It was calculated. It was the most insulting thing he could have done. He'd beaten her in combat, proved he could kill her, and then refused to claim the victory. Just kept walking, like she wasn't worth the effort to finish, like she was beneath his notice. Behind him, Vex shrieked. The sound was pure rage and humiliation, a cry that echoed through the bamboo grove and sent native birds scattering from the canopy. She tried to stand, pushing up on her arms, but her knee wouldn't hold. She fell again, caught herself on her hands. "You coward!" she screamed at his retreating back. Her voice was raw, breaking. "Face me, fight me, kill me or let me kill you, but don't you dare walk away." Scott didn't turn around, didn't speed up, didn't respond at all. He just maintained that measured pace, disappearing into the bamboo tunnel. Vex pounded her fist against the ground, once, twice, 3 times. Then she forced herself to stop, to think. Her knee was damaged but not broken. Azuri healing was fast, their bodies designed to recover from the brutal impacts of their hunting style. She'd be able to walk in an hour, maybe 2. She'd be able to run by evening, though not at full capacity. But as she pulled herself up using a bamboo stalk, as she tested weight on her injured leg and hissed at the pain, she looked at the trail the human had left, that same measured, patient trail leading ever onward. For the first time in her life, Vex began to truly understand what she was dealing with. This wasn't prey. This was something else. Something that didn't run. Something that didn't fear. Something that hunted. Vex pulled herself up using a bamboo stalk. Her knee was swelling rapidly, but Azuri healing was fast. She'd be able to walk in an hour, maybe 2. She'd be able to run by evening, though not at full capacity. She looked at the trail the human had left, that same measured, patient trail. For the first time, she began to understand what she was dealing with. The sun climbed toward its peak, and with it came the heat. The humidity in the jungle was oppressive, the air so thick with moisture it felt like breathing soup. The temperature soared into the high 30s Celsius, probably higher in the direct sunlight. For Scott, it was unpleasant but manageable. Sweat poured off him, soaking his clothes, dripping from his chin. His body's cooling system worked exactly as designed, using evaporative cooling to maintain his core temperature. He drank steadily from streams and collected water on broad leaves, replacing what he lost. For Vex, it was torture. Azuri had evolved on a hot world, yes, but a dry one. Desert conditions where temperature swings were extreme, but humidity was minimal. They cooled themselves through panting, rapid breathing that expelled heat from their lungs. In this soup-thick air, the system failed. The water vapor in each breath prevented efficient cooling. Her vision began to swim. Her movements, normally fluid and precise, became clumsy. She tripped over roots she should have easily cleared. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth, and still the human's trail led onward. She could see where he'd stopped briefly to drink, the impressions of his knees in the moss by a stream. Could see where he'd removed his shirt and tied it around his head as a sunshade. He looked ridiculous in the images her hunting mind constructed, shirtless and sweating and shambling. But his body kept working, kept cooling, kept moving. Around mid-afternoon, Vex found the first marker. It was obvious, deliberately placed, stones arranged in an arrow pointing forward along the trail. She stared at it, her overheated brain struggling to process the implications. He'd left it for her. He knew she was following. He wanted her to follow. She looked around the jungle, suddenly seeing threat in every shadow. This was wrong. Prey didn't do this. Prey ran, hid, tried to escape. They didn't lead hunters on, unless the roles had reversed, unless she wasn't the hunter anymore. Vex's hand went to her machete, gripping it so hard the leather wrap creaked. Her head swiveled, searching the dense foliage. Was he watching her right now? Was he waiting in ambush? Minutes passed. Nothing moved except the native insects, creatures like flying jewels that paid no attention to either human or Azuri. Finally, Vex moved forward, but the confidence was gone. Her steps were hesitant, her eyes constantly scanning. The predator had become prey, and somewhere in the green darkness, she knew the old human was laughing at her. Night fell like a hammer. Scott had been walking for 36 hours with only 2 brief stops. His body was beginning to rebel. The blisters on his feet had burst and reformed, and burst again. His shin, where he'd hit the rock crossing the river, was swollen and hot to the touch. His lower back was a constant scream of pain. But worse than the physical damage was the mental fatigue. His mind kept trying to drift, to escape into memory or fantasy. He'd see his wife Maria's face in the patterns of bark, hear his daughter Amy laughing in the jungle sounds. He stumbled, went down on one knee. The pain was distant, processed through a layer of exhaustion that made everything feel unreal. He stayed there for a long moment, head hanging. "Just rest," Maria's voice said. She sounded so real, so close. "You've done enough. Just rest." Scott looked up. For a moment, he could see her standing there in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. She wore the blue dress she'd married him in 43 years ago in a chapel in New Seattle. She was smiling. Scott looked up. For a moment, he could see her standing there in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy, so real he could almost smell her perfume, that lavender scent she always wore. She wore the blue dress she'd married him in 43 years ago in a chapel in New Seattle when they'd both been young and stupid and full of dreams about exploring the stars. She was smiling, but it was a sad smile, the one she'd given him when he'd signed up for the colony program, when he'd chosen adventure over stability. "I can't," he said aloud. His voice was a croak, his throat raw from dehydration and the constant breathing rhythm he'd been maintaining for 36 hours straight. "Why not? What are you trying to prove?" Maria walked closer, her movements fluid and graceful, exactly as he remembered. "The colony's gone, Scott. You know it is. The Azuri have been raiding for months. They're systematic, thorough. Amy and I were in the northern settlements. You were at the southern pumping station. We're gone." He didn't have a good answer, couldn't form the words. The colony was gone, most likely. The Azuri had been raiding with increasing frequency, taking people, destroying infrastructure. Maria and Amy had been in the northern settlements, helping to set up a new agricultural zone. He'd been working the southern pumping station, 40 hours into a 72-hour shift when they'd taken him. They were probably dead. "So why keep going?" Maria asked, her voice gentle. "What's the point? Who are you doing this for?" "Myself," Scott managed. "I'm doing it for myself." That's pride talking. Stubborn male pride. You always were too stubborn for your own good. Maybe. He looked down at his hands, skeletal and shaking. When had he lost so much weight? The last 2 days? 3? Time had stopped making sense. But I'm not going to let them win. I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. Of what? Watching you die slow instead of fast? That's what you're choosing, Scott. A slow death out here instead of a quick one back there. At least it's my choice. Maria's image flickered, started to fade around the edges. Stubborn old man, she said, but there was affection in it. The same affection she'd had when he'd refused to give up on a broken atmospheric processor, when he'd worked 36 hours straight to fix a life support system, when he'd crawled through toxic tunnels to reach a shut-off valve because he was the only one small enough to fit. Always so stubborn. That's what I loved about you. That's what I hated about you. Then she was gone, dissolving into the bioluminescent green of the jungle night. And Scott was alone with just the sound of his own ragged breathing and the alien symphony of creatures he couldn't see. He forced himself to start walking again. Left foot, right foot. The mantra had degraded now, become just sounds, meaningless syllables that kept his body moving while his mind shut down into survival mode. An hour later, maybe two, he saw Amy, his daughter, but not as she would be now, 31 years old and probably dead in the Azuri raids. He saw her as she'd been at 6, all gap-toothed smile and wild curly hair, chasing the native flying insects in the habitat gardens. "Daddy, look!" She held up her hands, cupped around something. "I caught one." "That's great, kiddo." The words came automatically, muscle memory of a conversation they'd had 2 decades ago. "Can I keep it?" "You know the rules. Look, learn, let go." Amy's smile faded. "You never let me keep anything." "That's not true. You never stayed. You were always working, always fixing something. Someone else's life support, someone else's water system, never home." The words hit like physical blows. He'd told himself he was doing it for them, all those extra shifts, all those emergency call-outs, building a better future, providing. But how many dinners had he missed? How many school events? How many nights had he come home to find Amy already asleep, Maria sitting alone in the dark? "I was trying to help," he said. "Were you? Or were you just running away?" Amy was older now, 15, angry, the way she'd been during the divorce proceedings. You couldn't handle things falling apart at home, so you hid in work, buried yourself in systems you could fix because people were too complicated. "That's not fair." "Life's not fair, Dad. You taught me that." She crossed her arms, so much like her mother, it hurt. "So why are you really doing this? Why are you killing yourself out here?" Scott opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. Why was he doing this? Revenge? Survival? Or was it something simpler, something more pathetic? Was he just proving to himself that he could still fix something, even if it was just his own life? That he could still solve a problem through sheer determination? "I don't know," he admitted finally, "but I'm not stopping." Amy faded, became shadows in moonlight, and Scott was alone again. He kept walking. Around what his scrambled sense of time suggested was 0300 hours, though it could have been earlier or later. He saw Roderick, his old crew chief from the first colony, the man who'd taught him everything about maintaining life support systems with nothing but determination and improvised parts. Roderick had died in a coolant leak 3 years ago, had died with Scott holding his hand while toxic gas filled both their lungs. Scott refusing to leave even when the alarm screamed at him to evacuate. "You always were a walker, Scott," Roderick said, sitting on a fallen log that Scott's failing visions suggested might not actually be there. The man was missing his front teeth, had lost them to a torque wrench accident and never bothered to get them fixed, said it gave him character. "Remember that time the transport broke down on the supply run and you walked all the way back to base rather than wait for pickup?" 32 clicks, Scott said automatically. 32, right? In that radiation zone too. Boss gave you hell for it, said you were wasting energy. That efficiency mattered more than pride. Radiation wasn't that bad. I stayed under my annual limit. Barely. Roderick grinned that gap-toothed grin. But you did it anyway. Not because it was smart, not because it was necessary, but because you needed to know you could. Because proving something to yourself mattered more than being sensible. What was I proving? Same thing you're proving now, that you don't quit. That when everything's falling apart and the systems are failing and there's no backup coming and all the indicators are reading red, you just keep working the problem. You don't stop. You don't give up. You just keep going until either the problem's solved or you're dead. Scott blinked and Roderick was gone. The log was just a shadow, or maybe just the pattern of moonlight on leaves. He kept walking. His feet were bleeding now. He could feel it with each step, warm wetness soaking into his improvised wrappings. His shin, where he'd hit the rock in the river, was swollen to twice its normal size, hot to the touch, probably infected. His lower back had gone from pain to numbness, which he knew from medical training was a bad sign, meant nerve damage. Around what he thought might be 0400 hours, he fell. Didn't trip this time, just collapsed. His legs gave out, his knees hit the ground, then he pitched forward onto his face. Lay there tasting dirt and blood and the sweet rot of decomposing leaves, his body absolutely refusing to obey the commands to get up. This was it, he thought dimly. This was where his body finally mutinied, said enough, and he just stayed down. Would the Azuri huntress find him here? Would she get her kill after all? Or would he just die here, be consumed by the jungle, become food for the alien ecosystem? Then he saw the beetle. It was tiny, no bigger than his thumbnail, bioluminescent like so many of the creatures here, glowing with a faint blue light that made it stand out against the dark soil. It was struggling to haul a piece of leaf 10 times its size up a small root that might as well have been a mountain for something so small. The leaf kept slipping, falling back down, and each time the beetle just adjusted its grip and tried again. Fall, climb, adjust, retry, over and over with the mindless determination of an organism following its programming. Scott watched it for a long time, his face in the dirt, too exhausted to even turn his head. The beetle never stopped, never reconsidered, never sat down and said, "This is stupid, this is impossible, I should just give up." It just kept trying, kept struggling, kept moving with the relentless patience of a creature that didn't know how to quit. "We're made of endurance," Scott whispered to the beetle, to himself, to the darkness and the jungle, and whatever gods might be listening. He thought of the old documentary again, the one that had fascinated him when he was 14, before the colony program, before Maria, before everything. The one about human evolution and persistence hunting. Humans weren't fast, weren't strong, didn't have claws or armor or venom, but they could run. They could run after kudu and antelope and wildebeest through the scorching African savanna, could run for hours while the prey animals overheated and died, could run until their own bodies were at the edge of collapse, but their prey had crossed that edge first. That was humanity's gift. Not intelligence, not tool use, not language, though those helped. Humanity's gift was endurance, the ability to just keep going when everything else in nature had stopped. The stubborn refusal to quit that had taken a species of tree-climbing apes and made them the apex predator of an entire planet. "We don't stop," Scott said to the beetle, his voice stronger now. "That's what evolution gave us, the ability to just keep going when everything else has quit." He grabbed his spear and used it to lever himself upright. His legs shook so violently he thought they might give out again. But they held, barely. His vision swam, dark spots blooming and fading at the edges. His heart hammered in his chest, probably over 180 beats per minute, probably doing damage with every beat. He didn't care. Left foot, he told himself. Just move the left foot. He did. Right foot. He did. Breathe. He kept walking. The beetle was lost in the darkness behind him, still struggling with its leaf, still trying, still refusing to quit, because quitting wasn't in its programming. Same as quitting wasn't in his. Dawn came slowly to the jungle, gray light filtering through the canopy in shafts that looked almost solid in the humid air. Scott had been moving for 48 hours now, with only the briefest of stops. His mind had entered a strange state, half awake and half dreaming, where the boundary between reality and hallucination had become dangerously thin. He heard the pack before he saw them, a rustling in the undergrowth to his left, coordinated movement that spoke of multiple creatures working together. His engineer's brain, still functioning despite the exhaustion, cataloged the data. Pack hunters, probably the six-legged canid analogs the colonists had called razorbacks because of the ridge of blade-like bone running down their spines. They emerged from the foliage in a semicircle, 5 of them, each about the size of a large dog, but built low to the ground with powerful haunches. Their fur was mottled blue and black, perfect camouflage in the jungle shadows. Their eyes were yellow, intelligent, assessing. Scott stopped walking. His hand tightened on his spear, but he knew it was useless. 5 against 1, and these creatures were fresh while he was half dead. If they decided to attack, he'd maybe take one with him before they tore him apart. The pack leader, distinguishable by a scar across its muzzle, took a step forward. Its lips pulled back, revealing teeth designed for shearing meat. A low growl rumbled from its throat. Scott didn't run, didn't show fear. Instead, he did something that probably saved his life. He growled back. It wasn't a human sound. It came from somewhere deep in his chest, a primal expression of defiance that transcended species. "I'm hurt," the growl said. "I'm dying. But I'll make you pay for killing me." The pack leader hesitated, its head tilted, yellow eyes studying this strange creature that smelled of blood and infection and exhaustion, but still refused to show submission. Scott took a step forward. Another growl, louder this time. The spear came up, not in defense but in threat. He beat the weapon against a tree trunk, creating a sharp crack that echoed through the jungle, making noise, making himself seem bigger, more dangerous than he actually was. The pack leader made a decision. This prey was injured, yes, but it was also dangerous, unpredictable. The smell coming off it was wrong, chemicals and synthetic materials mixed with blood and fear sweat. And there was other easier food in the jungle. It yipped once, a sharp command, and the pack melted back into the undergrowth like smoke. Scott stood there for a full minute after they left, his legs shaking so badly he had to lean on his spear to stay upright. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system, temporarily pushing back the exhaustion. Then as the immediate threat passed, the fatigue came crashing back twice as hard. He started walking again, because that's what he did. He walked. Around mid-morning, he reached a stream he hadn't crossed before. The water was clear, running fast over smooth stones that gleamed like polished glass in the dappled sunlight. His water bladder was nearly empty, and he needed to refill it. But first, he needed to do something about his feet. He sat down heavily on a fallen log, the impact sending a spike of pain through his damaged back. For a moment, he just sat there, savoring the simple act of not moving. Then he carefully unwrapped the makeshift bindings on his feet. The sight that greeted him was worse than he'd expected. The blisters had evolved into open wounds, raw flesh weeping clear fluid mixed with blood. The toes on his left foot were swollen, the skin tight and hot to the touch. Infection, definitely. The right foot wasn't much better. Every step for the last 12 hours had been agony, but he'd pushed it down, ignored it, the way he'd learned to ignore failing systems alarms when you were still working on a fix. But ignoring a problem didn't make it go away. It just let it get worse. Scott cleaned the wounds as best he could in the stream, hissing through his teeth at the pain. The cold water helped with the swelling, though it felt like ice picks driving into raw nerves. He watched the water run red, then pink, then clear as the blood washed away. He found a plant growing near the water's edge, something with broad leaves that oozed a milky white sap when broken. He'd seen one of the herbivores rubbing against it yesterday, a six-legged creature with a gash on its flank. The animal had been deliberately applying the sap to its wound. Maybe antiseptic, maybe poison. Only one way to find out. Scott tested the sap on a small scratch on his arm first. Waited 10 minutes, watching for signs of reaction. Redness, swelling, itching. When none came, he carefully applied it to the worst of the foot wounds. It burned like fire for the first minute, a deep chemical burn that made him bite down on a stick to keep from screaming. Then the burning faded to a distant throb, and the area went partially numb. Better than nothing. He rewrapped his feet with fresh strips torn from what was left of his jumpsuit, creating new padding over the worst areas. The synthetic fabric was nearly gone now, sacrificed piece by piece to survival. He'd be walking in rags by the time this was over, if he survived. Then he filled his water bladder, drank deeply from the stream until his stomach was uncomfortably full, and forced himself to eat. He had a few of the root vegetables he'd harvested, bitter and fibrous, but edible. His stomach cramped at the food, having gone too long without proper nutrition, but he kept it down through sheer will. 20 minutes. That's all he allowed himself. 20 minutes of sitting, of not moving, of letting his body rest and his mind drift. He thought about Regina and the others. Had they survived? Were any of them still out there, still running? Or had the Azuri hunters taken them all? He hoped Regina had made it. She was smart, tough, resourceful. If anyone could outlast the hunters, it was her. Maybe she'd found a place to hide, a cave or a hollow tree. Maybe she was already making her way back to what was left of the colony. Or maybe she was dead, torn apart by an Azuri blade, or paralyzed by the thorns, or killed by any of the 1,000 other ways this world could murder you. Scott stood up, tested his weight on the newly wrapped feet. The numbness from the plant sap helped. He could walk. That's all that mattered. He had maybe 30 kilometers to the plateau. At his current pace, accounting for his deteriorating condition, that was 8 more hours. 8 more hours of walking, of ignoring the pain, of pushing his body past every reasonable limit. 8 more hours. He could do that. He'd done harder things. He'd worked 96-hour shifts when the life support system failed on the Kepler colony. He'd walked 40 kilometers through a radiation zone when the transport broke down. He'd held Roderick's hand while the man died from toxic gas, refusing to leave even when his own lungs were burning. 8 more hours was nothing. Left foot, right foot, breathe. He kept walking. Behind him, following his trail at a distance, Vex was also walking, not running anymore. She'd burned through her ability to run, used it all up in the first 2 days. Now she was reduced to the same plodding pace as her prey, and the humiliation of it was almost worse than the physical pain. Her knee had swollen to twice its normal size, hot and tight with fluid. Each step sent lightning bolts of pain up her leg, but she ignored it the way the human ignored his wounds. Because stopping meant admitting defeat, and she couldn't do that. Not yet, not when she was so close. She'd found his rest stop by the stream, had seen the bloody wrappings he'd discarded, the evidence of wounds that should have crippled him, should have stopped him. But his trail led on, those same measured footprints heading toward the plateau. How was he still moving? How was it possible? Vex's understanding of humans was limited. Her clan had been hunting them for 3 seasons, ever since the migration ships had brought the Azuri to this world, and they'd discovered the human colony in the northern valleys. To the Azuri, humans were soft things, slow, weak, built for labor, not fighting. Easy prey that screamed and begged and broke quickly under pressure. But this one was different. This one had turned the hunt inside out, had made her the prey through nothing but sheer, relentless endurance. And she still couldn't understand how a creature so obviously inferior could do this to her. She thought about giving up, thought about turning back, claiming she'd killed him, and no one could prove otherwise. The other hunters would believe her. She was Vex, after all. She never failed. But she knew she wouldn't lie, because even if she could fool her clan, she couldn't lie to herself. And she needed to see this through to the end, needed to understand what kind of creature could do this to her. So she kept walking, following the trail of the monster who wore a human's face. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat again. Scott's body was handling it better now, adapted to the conditions after 3 days of constant movement. His sweat glands worked overtime, coating him in a sheen of moisture that evaporated in the humid air, cooling him through the same process that had kept his ancestors alive on the African plains 2 million years ago. He thought about evolution a lot as he walked, thought about the millions of years of selection pressure that had shaped the human body into this specific form. Not the fastest predator, not the strongest, not the most armored or venomous or camouflaged, but the most persistent, the one that just didn't stop. Humans were cursorial hunters, distance runners, built to chase prey until it literally died from exhaustion. It was an insane strategy when you thought about it. What kind of species hunts by just following their target until it drops dead? But it worked. It had worked for millions of years. It had taken humans from the bottom of the food chain to the top, had let them dominate an entire planet despite having none of the natural weapons their competitors possessed. And now on an alien world against an alien predator, that same ancient strategy was working again. Because biology was biology, evolution was evolution, and the laws of thermodynamics didn't care what planet you were on. Energy in, energy out. Endurance versus sprint. The mathematics were universal. Scott smiled, a grim expression that pulled at his cracked lips and made them bleed. He was a walking, breathing example of human evolutionary advantage. A 45-year-old maintenance engineer who should have died on the first day, proving that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't intelligence or tools or cooperation. It was stubbornness. Pure, bloody-minded refusal to quit. The plateau came into view around early afternoon. Scott stood at the base of the cliffs, looking up at the 200 meters of vertical stone that stood between him and the end of this hunt. His body was a catalog of failures. His feet were destroyed. His shin was infected. His back was locked in spasm. His hands shook with muscle fatigue. His vision swam with dehydration and exhaustion. But he'd made it. 70-plus kilometers through hostile jungle. 3 days and nights of continuous movement. He'd run the Azuri Huntress into the ground, had proven that humanity's ancient gift still worked, still mattered, even here at the edge of known space. Now he just had to climb. Vex woke just before dawn, her body rigid with pain. The knee injury from yesterday's fight had partially healed while she slept, but it was still weak. More concerning was the overall exhaustion. She'd run hard for 2 days, fought the terrain, endured temperature extremes her body wasn't designed for. She needed food, real food, not the emergency rations she carried. She needed rest, at least a full day of it. But the human was still out there, still moving. She knew because before sleeping, she'd climbed a tall tree despite her injured knee. From the canopy, in the last light of dusk, she'd seen smoke, a tiny thread of it, kilometers ahead. The human had made a fire. That was wrong too. Prey didn't advertise their location, unless it was a trap. Vex packed up her meager camp and started moving. Her pace was slower now, conservation of energy taking priority over speed. She scanned the trail for signs of ambush, for tripwires or pit traps. She found nothing but that endless, patient trail. Around mid-morning, she found his fire site. It was in a small clearing, carefully managed. He'd burned green wood to create smoke, probably to signal his location. The ashes were arranged in a pattern. Vex stared at them, her mind slowly decoding the message. It was a map, rough but clear enough. It showed the river, the bamboo grove, and ahead a series of ridges leading up to the plateau country. He was telling her where he was going. She looked up at the distant line of cliffs, visible through a gap in the canopy. The plateau, the Badlands. Dead-end country with no water and nowhere to hide. Why would he go there? Vex's stomach cramped with hunger. She'd finished her rations last night. There was food in the jungle, if you knew where to look. But she didn't. This wasn't her world. She was burning energy she couldn't replace. The smart move would be to turn back, declare the hunt a draw. Survival trumped pride. But then she thought of her clan brothers and sisters, watching from the platforms. Thought of the bets placed against her. Thought of the old human's eyes measuring her, judging her. She started toward the plateau. Before dawn on the third day, Scott did something that required every bit of nerve he had left. He doubled back. It took him 2 hours to carefully backtrack along his own trail, moving with the silent patience of a man who had nothing left but determination. His body protested every step. His bleeding feet screamed. His infected shin throbbed with each heartbeat. But he moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn darkness, following the disturbed vegetation and scent markers that told him where the Azuri Huntress was camped. He found her an hour before sunrise. She was curled around the dying embers of a heat pack, her blue skin almost purple in the cold morning air. Exhausted, vulnerable, her breathing was deep and regular, the sleep of someone pushed beyond their limits. Scott stood 10 meters away, his crude knife gripped in his shaking hand, and stared at her. He could end this now. One quick strike. She'd never wake up. The hunt would be over. His hand tightened on the knife. He took a step closer, then another. His engineer's mind cataloged the vulnerabilities. The throat, obviously, but the Azuri neck structure was heavily muscled. The eyes, vulnerable but might not kill fast enough. The major vessels in the inner thigh, similar to human anatomy based on what he'd observed. He stood over her, knife raised, and looked down at the creature who'd hunted him for 2.5 days. She looked smaller in sleep, younger. The ritual scars on her skin told stories of other hunts, other kills. She was a predator, yes, but she was also just following her nature, doing what her species had evolved to do. Scott lowered the knife. Killing her wouldn't prove anything. It would just be murder. But there was something else he could do, something that would be far more devastating to her pride. He knelt beside her pack with infinite care, moving so slowly it took 5 minutes to get into position. His hands found her water bladder, the precious container of liquid that was keeping her alive in this hostile environment. He pulled out his knife and carefully, precisely, cut through the carrying strap. The leather parted with barely a whisper of sound. Vex didn't stir. Scott lifted the water bladder free. It was half full, maybe half a liter. Precious, irreplaceable out here. He tucked it into his own pack. Then, because the insult needed to be complete, he examined her pack more carefully. Found the shoulder strap, the main one that held the weight. He made a small cut in the leather, not all the way through, but enough that it would fail under stress. When she moved quickly, when she ran, the pack would break and dump her remaining supplies. He backed away, still moving with glacial slowness. When he was 20 meters away, he allowed himself to breathe normally again. As he turned to leave, he looked back one more time. She'd sleep for another hour at least, maybe 2. When she woke, she'd find her water gone. She'd know he'd been there, standing over her, close enough to kill her, and she'd know he'd chosen not to. That would hurt worse than any wound. Scott melted back into the jungle, resuming his steady march toward the plateau. Vex woke 2 hours after dawn with the sun already climbing. Her body was stiff, her knees still painful, but the rest had helped. She sat up, reaching automatically for her water bladder to rinse the foul taste from her mouth. Her hand closed on empty air. She looked down at her pack. The water bladder was gone. The strap had been cut cleanly with a blade. For a long moment, she just stared at the cut leather, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Then understanding hit like a physical blow. He'd been here, the human, while she slept. He'd stood over her, close enough to take her water, close enough to cut her straps, close enough to kill her. And he'd let her live. Vex's hands started to shake. Not from fear, though there was fear there too. From humiliation. From the absolute crushing realization that she, the hunter, had been at the mercy of her prey. That he could have ended it and chosen not to. That he'd stolen her water and left her alive to suffer the consequences. She stood up, grabbed her pack, and the damaged shoulder strap immediately gave way. Her remaining supplies spilled across the ground. Food rations, heat packs. Her spare throwing spear rolled away into the underbrush. "No!" The scream tore from her throat, raw and primal. She kicked at the scattered supplies, rage and humiliation burning through her in equal measure. He'd been here, had stood over her sleeping form, had taken what he wanted, had sabotaged her equipment, and she'd never even woken up. She was the hunter. She was supposed to be superior, faster, stronger, better. But the old human had just taught her a lesson in complete and utter dominance, and he'd done it without killing her, which somehow made it worse. Vex gathered what supplies she could carry without a pack, fashioning a crude bundle with her damaged straps. She had no water, no way to effectively carry what little food remained, and ahead the trail led to the plateau, the Badlands, where there would be no water at all. The smart move, the survival move, would be to turn back now. Admit defeat, live to hunt another day. But as she looked at the trail, at those patient, measured footprints leading ever onward, she felt something crystallize inside her. This wasn't about hunting anymore. This wasn't about the sport or the bets or proving her superiority. This was personal. She started running toward the plateau, using the last of her strength in a desperate sprint. She had to catch him, had to face him. Even if it killed her, she had to look him in the eyes one more time. Behind her, she left her heat packs, her extra food, everything but her machete and the tattered remains of her pride. Scott reached the base of the cliffs around noon on the third day. His body was failing in measurable ways. He'd lost at least 5 kilos, probably more. His hands shook constantly. His vision occasionally doubled. When he urinated, the color was dark, almost brown. Severe dehydration despite his best efforts. He sat down heavily on a rock and looked up at the cliff face. It was maybe 200 meters of vertical limestone, pocked with handholds but demanding. At the top, he knew from survey reports, was a plateau of broken rock and scraggly vegetation. A dead end. Behind him, he could hear the Azuri coming. She wasn't being quiet anymore. Probably couldn't be. He'd run her into the ground, same as any antelope. He allowed himself 1 minute of rest. Then he started climbing. The ascent was agony. Every muscle screamed. His injured shin throbbed with each push upward. His hands, soft from years of office work despite the manual labor, split open on the rough rock. But humans were climbers. Arboreal apes who'd come down from the trees but never lost the ability to go back up. His shoulders, designed for throwing and lifting, handled the pulling motion. His flexible spine and hips allowed him to distribute his weight, to find positions that more rigid body plans couldn't achieve. He climbed steadily, mechanically, not looking down. Vex emerged from the jungle at the base of the cliff 20 minutes after Scott began his climb. She looked up and saw him, perhaps halfway to the top, moving with the slow determination of continental drift. She should have been relieved. He'd trapped himself. Dead end. She could wait him out, let him exhaust himself on the climb, then finish it when he came down. But something in her, some deep predator instinct, demanded she pursue. Demanded she prove her superiority by matching his feat. She began to climb. The Azuri were stronger than humans, pound for pound. Their bone ridges provided natural armor, and their muscle density was higher. But that same strength came with a cost. Muscle mass required constant energy, and the climb, this grinding, endless vertical struggle, demanded sustained effort rather than explosive power. 10 meters up, Vex's muscles began to burn. The buildup of lactic acid, the waste product of anaerobic respiration, hit her harder and faster than it would a human. Her species had evolved for sprints, for the explosive hunt, not marathons. 20 meters up, she was gasping. Her mouth hung open, her tongue lolling as she tried to cool herself through panting. But the moisture in the air prevented effective heat exchange. Her core temperature climbed. 30 meters up, she vomited. The blue-tinged bile splattered on the rocks below. Her stomach cramped, empty, burning. Her vision swam. But above her, visible through the haze of her exhaustion, the old human kept climbing. Same pace, same mechanical pulling motion. She climbed after him, driven now by pure rage, by the absolute refusal to be beaten by this inferior creature. Scott pulled himself over the edge of the plateau and collapsed. For a full minute, he simply lay there, chest heaving, tasting blood from his torn lungs. Then he forced himself to sit up, to move back from the edge. The plateau was exactly as the surveys had described. Broken limestone karst, scattered with hardy scrub plants, no water, no shelter. Behind him, maybe 200 meters away, the plateau ended in a sheer drop into a different valley. A dead end. He'd climbed to his own execution ground. He heard scrabbling below, looked over the edge and saw the Azuri huntress, still climbing. She was maybe 20 meters down, her movements jerky and uncontrolled. As he watched, her hand slipped. She caught herself, barely, and hung there for a moment. Scott could end it now. There were rocks everywhere. One good throw, and she'd fall. Die on the rocks below, her superior speed and strength meaning nothing. He picked up a stone, weighed it, then set it down. Instead, he stood and backed away from the edge, giving her space. Vex pulled herself onto the plateau in stages, each movement taking more effort than she had to give. Finally, she rolled over the edge and lay there, unable to move. Her body had failed. Completely, catastrophically failed. The technical term was rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of muscle tissue from extreme exertion. Proteins from the destroyed muscle cells flooded her bloodstream, poisoning her. Her muscles had literally been consumed for fuel, and now they wouldn't respond to her brain's commands. She could see the old human, standing 10 meters away. He looked like death itself. His skin was gray under the grime and dried blood. His eyes were sunken. His clothes hung in rags. But he was standing. He held his sharpened stick loosely in one hand, ready but not threatening. Vex tried to speak. Her mouth worked, but only a croak came out. She swallowed, tried again. "Why don't you run, human?" The words came out thick, slurred. "Your kind always run. Sprint until your hearts burst." Scott took a step closer. He looked down at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not triumph, not pity, something else. Understanding, maybe. "Because you predators are built for the sprint," he said. His voice was quiet, hoarse from dehydration, but absolutely certain. Fast twitch muscle, explosive power, built to chase down prey in seconds or minutes. He took another step, closer now. She tried to move, to raise her machete, but her arm wouldn't obey. "My species evolved differently," Scott continued. He lowered himself carefully to sit on a rock, and she realized the movement wasn't casual. He was sitting because standing took energy he could barely spare. "We hunted by persistence, ran after animals for hours, days if necessary, in the heat of the African savanna. We have sweat glands over every inch of our skin. We can cool ourselves and keep moving in conditions that would kill you. We're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, but we can keep going long after everything else has dropped dead from exhaustion." He met her eyes. "I wasn't running from you. I was running you to death." The words hit Vex like a physical blow. She understood now. The river crossing, using his ability to swim, the heat of midday, when her cooling system failed and his worked perfectly. The endless walking that burned through her explosive energy reserves while barely touching his endurance tanks. The climb that required sustained effort rather than bursts of speed. Every step had been calculated. Every choice made to exploit the fundamental differences between their species. He'd been hunting her from the moment the horn sounded. She tried to lunge at him, tried to make one last attack, to salvage something from the humiliation. Her body didn't respond. Her muscles were dead weight. She pitched forward, fell on her face at his feet, unable to even protect herself in the fall. Scott looked down at her. She waited for the killing blow. Instead, he pulled out a knife, carefully crafted from a piece of scrap metal, and reached for her head. She felt him grab a section of her hair, the long blue braids she wore as a mark of her hunting prowess. The knife sawed through it. Then he was moving away. She heard water slosh. Something landed next to her face. The stolen water bladder, the one she'd woken to find missing yesterday morning, the one that had driven home just how close he'd come while she slept, helpless. "Drink," Scott said from somewhere above her. "You've got a long crawl back to your people." She heard his footsteps, that same steady rhythm, walking away. Vex managed to turn her head. Through blurred vision, she saw him moving toward the cliff edge, but not the one they'd climbed. The far edge where the plateau dropped into the next valley. He was leaving, walking away from his victory without claiming her life, without even watching her degradation. The ultimate insult. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to curse him, but her throat wouldn't work. Scott reached the far edge and looked down. It was a steep descent, treacherous, but there was a goat trail visible in the scree. He could make it, eventually, when his legs decided to work properly again. He turned to survey the plateau one last time and froze. They were everywhere. Azuri, dozens of them, perched on the rocks, in the scrubby trees, along the cliff edges. Silent observers who'd followed the hunt, probably from the second day. Their blue skin looked purple in the afternoon light. Scott's hand tightened on his spear. If they attacked now, he was dead. Too exhausted to fight. Too far from any escape. But they didn't move. Didn't raise weapons. They just watched. One of them, an older male with bone ridges, so developed they looked like a crown, slowly lowered his head. A gesture of acknowledgement, of respect. The others followed suit. One by one, the assembled Azuri bowed to the human who had beaten their champion hunter not through strength or speed, but through the grinding, inexorable endurance of his species. Scott stood there for a moment, swaying on his feet. Then he turned his back on them and started down the goat trail. His legs nearly gave out on the first step. He caught himself on his spear, waited for the trembling to pass, then continued. Left foot, right foot, breathe. The mantra had brought him this far. It would carry him the rest of the way. Behind him, on the plateau, Vex finally managed to reach the water bladder. Her hands shook so badly she could barely open it. She raised it to her lips and drank the human's water, the gift from a creature she'd thought inferior, and she wept. The other Azuri remained motionless, watching the old human descend into the valley, watching him disappear into the evening mist. Not running, not fleeing, just walking at that same steady, terrifying pace that had broken their best hunter's body and spirit. Somewhere in the jungle below, a whistle bear howled. The sound echoed off the cliffs, lonely and wild. Scott heard it and kept walking. The sound of his footsteps on stone, rhythmic and patient, faded into the growing darkness.